Hi, I'm Gary, and this is episode 204 of EV Musings, a podcast about renewables, electric vehicles, and things that are interesting to electric vehicle owners. On the show today, we'll be looking a little bit more at misinformation. This season of the podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the free-to-download app that helps EV drivers search, plan, and pay for their charging. This particular episode is in partnership with EVA England, the body advocating on behalf of electric vehicle drivers in England. See the show notes for membership details and a link to their website. Before we start, I wanted to say hello to anyone who's listening to this while either driving or walking/jogging. If you could make a mental note that a lot of what we talk about in all the episodes is contained in the show notes, alongside transcriptions for many shows. We're slowly working through those. So when you get back to somewhere you can use your phone safely and comfortably, be sure to have a look at them. Now, our main topic of discussion today is misinformation. The very first episode of this podcast back in March 2019 was entitled Myths and Legends. In that show, Simon and I talked about the key narratives that seem to exist around electric vehicles that were propagated primarily by people who didn't drive them. Things like, you can't drive them in the rain, and the range isn't far enough, and there's nowhere to charge them, and the batteries will last 3 years, then you'll have to throw them away. That sort of thing. Now, in the intervening 5 years, things have moved on a lot. Range anxiety has come and gone. The myths about batteries have mostly, but not totally come and gone. But a lot of other anti-EV narratives have sprung up in their place. Last season, we chatted with Claire Cullen and Quentin Wilson from Stop Burning Stuff about some of the efforts they're making to combat this. As Quentin said at the time, misinformation will kill the EV transition if we let it. Today, I want to address some of the more recent bits of misinformation that seem to have sprung up. Now, to help me discuss the new and improved misinformation and how much of it is made up of complete trash versus a sliver of truth that's been beaten to death with the bias hammer, I'm joined by Colin Walker.
My name's Colin Walker. I'm Head of Transport at the Energy and Climate Intelligence Unit, which is a bit of a boast. We just call ourselves ECIU for short. We're just a group of think tank analysts. We exist to ensure that all the debates surrounding the net zero transition are actually informed by the facts, because there's a lot of, as I'm sure your listeners will appreciate, a lot of nonsense said about electric vehicles or heat pumps or offshore wind or home insulation. And our job is just to ensure that the facts are actually being put into the debate. So particularly our political decision makers are actually, not being overly influenced by non-factual narratives, we'll call them.
Oh, I like that. Non-factual narratives. I'm going to start using that one. So what does your role specifically involve?
So Head of Transport, we've existed for 10 years, but we only set up our transport program a year and a half ago. And it's to do that. It's to all the debates surrounding how we decarbonize our transport sector, ensuring that those debates are informed by the facts. Obviously, transport is huge. It's the single biggest source of emissions in the UK. So it's a big thing to focus on. So 99% of my time is focused on the electric vehicles debate, because that's where we feel the greatest, again, euphemistically, we'll call them narrative challenges exist. So it's just really about understanding the myths that are doing the rounds in the press and carrying out research, gathering the data and working with journalists to get the true story out there in the media. It's not always the easiest thing to do. We've certainly got a way to go. It keeps me very busy.
So who are your customers? Who do you sell your services to specifically?
So ultimately, the people we're trying to ensure are getting access to the correct information, the actual facts about electric vehicles, for example, are our politicians. The people we work with to do that are journalists and the media. Obviously, I will work with a lot of other organizations such as Transport and Environment or EVA England or Fully Charged or a whole range of different organizations to get access to the information I need, put that into a an article or press release that is of interest to a journalist, and hopefully they'll produce it and it will get read by a parliamentarian.
You have a lot of data to tend to back up your statement. So you mentioned briefly about some of the sources there, but Talk to me about where you get your data from and how you can be sure that it's accurate and not necessarily also being influenced by the same kind of sources that you've been talking about.
Yeah, it's a good question. The important thing, which is true for so many things, is to kind of like judge your sources. I think we'll work quite a lot. We'll use an awful lot of government collected data. We will we will speak to a lot of organizations that represent different interests that are involved in the issue, such as the SMMT, Society for Motor Manufacturers and Traders, whilst taking into account, there's a difference between raw data and data that's been interpreted to get a message out there that furthers the interests of the organization communicating it. So it's just always about kind of like assessing the reliability of the information that we use and the sources. And to be honest, that goes back for me. I've always had a personal bugbear about, in the world of social media, people are so reliant. And I get this all the time. I get people going, yeah, but some guy on YouTube told me this. And that is not a credible source of information. I will put up, you get a lot of people who go, I know this bloke who's got an EV and he's going back to petrol and he hates it. But actually surveys consistently show that 90% of EV drivers plus have no intention of going back to petrol or diesel. And that's where I think the debate really suffers, is that people's inability to understand the difference between a kind of statistically relevant survey with a decent sample size and one anecdote told to you by some guy you met in the pub. I think we've got a real problem when we're trying to challenge some of the myths that are doing the rounds about EVs, is people don't differentiate between the two. And I literally got into this exchange with someone yesterday who kind of went, oh, that survey showing 90% of drivers, it only had 536 survey things. Well, actually, that is actually still a relatively kind of sophisticated sample. And I shared with him others that had survey sizes of 3,000, and they went, yeah, but that's just EV drivers. That's bias. You're like, well, if you want to know what percentage of EV drivers want to go back to petrol and diesel, how could you possibly ask anyone other than EV drivers? Like, you're going to ask people who drive petrol cars if they intend to go back from their EV to petrol. It doesn't make any sense. So there's a real lack of understanding about statistics and sample size. And I don't expect everyone to get that. But I think people, particularly in the age of social media, aren't necessarily equipped with the tools to differentiate between what is a credible and a not credible source of information. And that is really screwing up the debate around a whole range of different things across society. One small part of that is the electric vehicle debate.
The other aspect of that, which I find particularly annoying, is when someone comes up and says, this happened with an electric vehicle and it's bad, therefore all electric vehicles are bad. But when a similar thing happens with a fossil fuel car, it doesn't mean that all fossil fuel cars are bad.
And what you've got there, I think, is you've got this kind of vicious doom loop that the media really contributes to here. Unsurprisingly, people are particularly interested in stories of a new technology. So the media will jump on any opportunity. For example, if there is a fire and it is reputed to have been an electric vehicle, and almost in all cases it isn't, that is newsworthy. That is put front and center on the BBC or the Telegraph's website because they know it will generate clicks. So that, because people see it reported in the news, people therefore think this is newsworthy, this is an issue, this is something I should be concerned about. But a diesel car bursting into flames is not considered a newsworthy event, so it doesn't get reported. So people just simply don't understand how many car fires there are every year. There's something like 100,000 vehicle fires in the UK every year. Between 25 and 35 people in the UK die every year in a vehicle fire. Not a single one of them recorded instance of someone dying in an electric vehicle fire yet. We all know when there is one. It'll be tragic, but it will be jumped all over by the press. So this 24-hour news cycle, desire for like clickability, clickbait, getting people going through to their links, drives this completely distorted reporting of risk. And yeah, people just are coming away with this notion that EVs are going to burst into flames in a death traps. And I was like, if you are worried about driving a vehicle and it bursting into flames with you in it, the best thing you can do is drive an electric vehicle. If you want to minimize the risk of that happening, ditch your petrol car immediately. That is a comparative death trap, statistically, in getting in an EV. But people have got a very different impression because the stats and that sense of risk is not being communicated.
Internal combustion engine. The clue's in the name, really, isn't it?
My sister's a firefighter. She's been to enough car crashes on the M6 to know that petrol and diesel cars burn and can set fire. And there are definite challenges of electric vehicles in terms of once the fire's going, putting them out. That is a challenge for the fire service. But the thing is, they often don't, the fires don't take hold that quick. and you've got you're much more, if you're in a car with an EV that's about to set alight, you're going to get out of it before the fire is bad. I just think, risk-wise, drive an EV.
Let's go through and cover at a fairly high level some of the myths that tend to persist, because, I've been driving electric since 2018. And of course, the big myth there was your car won't go anywhere because it's, the range is too small and there's nowhere to charge it. And those have kind of gone away. But the ones that tend to persist at the moment are buying an EV is a risk because you might be left with a big bill for a new battery. And then the other side to that is the EV batteries, they only last about 3 years and then they go into landfill. So we've got what I've termed Schrodinger's battery. It's too expensive to replace, but it's cheap enough to throw into landfill.
Oh, I think Schrodinger would have a field day with almost all aspects of the electric vehicle debate. Well, yeah, there's a whole number of myths. Right, so what do you want me to start specifically with that one about batteries? Yeah, if that was true, why do car manufacturers confidently offer 8-year warranties on the batteries that they sell? You don't do that if there's a risk that you'll end up paying out and fixing lots and lots of batteries because you bankrupt yourself. You offer warranties that you are confident will result in you very, very, very rarely ever having to fix something under warranty. So that in itself is a kind of a bit of a vote of confidence in the kind of health of batteries. And, the EVs haven't even been around that long. We're only beginning to approach a stage in which maybe some of the very earliest electric vehicles are beginning to come to the end of their lives, because the average life of a vehicle is about 14 years. And, you've got people like Nissan going, the batteries outlive the vehicle. They're quite often, when the vehicle comes to the end of its life, the battery can still be repurposed for something. So there was a great story about how battery packs from Nissan Leafs that come to the end of their lives are being repurposed as energy storage at Ajax's stadium in Amsterdam. The Jaguar Land Rover is taking used batteries and using them to build an energy storage facility to help balance the grid. So actually what often happens is that the batteries outlast the life of the car. Which had a really good survey in which they spoke to their EV owners, and they found that even people owning vehicles that are about EVs are about 8 years old, their average battery life was still at 92%. So they were losing about 1% in battery degradation every year. And that's much, much lower than the kind of like the doomsayers on the internet will tell you. But that's the problem, is that this perception that the batteries will die and you'll be landed with a £10,000 bill to replace it take root. And the government has come from quite a bit of criticism from the House of Lords Committee recently for not doing enough to tackle all the misinformation that's doing the rounds. So we do need more credible sources of information offering people that data, that reassurance that this isn't a problem. It's why Auto Trader, I know, are pushing for, kind of WTLP style tests, the expected health of a battery in each individual vehicle. So you're buying a used vehicle with some confidence that the battery you're getting in it will last for quite a long time. And that's incredibly important. The secondhand market, it's where 80% of us buy our cars. It's where the vast majority of people are going to make the transition to EVs. That I do think that is a significant barrier preventing people from getting a secondhand EV. So I think government and industry could step in and offer some kind of like data and tests that could offer consumers more confidence when buying a secondhand EV.
I want to come back in a little while and talk about the House of Lords report, because I know you did a quite substantial thread on that. So we'll go through that a little bit later. But talk to me about the recent Advertising Standards Association ruling that EVs aren't zero emissions. Now, apart from the tautological problems defining zero emissions and zero emissions at tailpipe, while still having an office for zero emissions vehicle, what's your whole take on that?
It's just quite frustrating. Look, I get it. I think most people who buy a zero emission vehicle would understand that actually at present, as we're transitioning to a zero emission economy, that still some emissions will be produced in manufacturing and building that vehicle, right? But the vehicle itself doesn't produce any emissions from the tailpipe. And it's terminology, nomenclature that we have used now for quite some time to define a vehicle which doesn't produce any emissions from the tailpipe. It's what we all use. As you say, the government has introduced a zero emission vehicle mandate. It is asking manufacturers to increase the proportion of zero emission vehicles that it produces and sells every year. And now the ASA has told people that it's not allowed to advertise those vehicles to achieve those targets, to call them zero emission vehicles. It feels like I feel a bit sorry for the car manufacturers a little bit. They've been set these quite ambitious targets, and now they've been told they can't advertise their vehicles as zero emission to achieve a zero emission vehicle mandate. It's unhelpful. I think a conversation between government and the regulator needs to kind of be had to kind of like agree on the terminology that is used. And I think the problem for the ASA is I don't agree with their ruling, but I'd have a little bit more sympathy with it if there weren't other rulings that are kind of really quite inconsistent. So the one it said in which it allowed the likes of Toyota and Lexus to carry on referring to their hybrids as self-charging hybrids. Apparently that's okay. Apparently you can give people the notion that they can buy a car that magically kind of produces electricity from thin air rather than from burning petrol in an internal combustion engine. That's apparently okay. You can make that claim, but you can't say that a battery electric vehicle is a zero emission vehicle. And it creates a false equivalence between those different vehicles, suggests that they're kind of all the same when it comes to environmental impact. But we know with the grid, the UK's grid as it is, producing about 40% of electricity from renewables, well over half from zero or low emission carbon sources, that a car being driven in the UK, an EV being driven in the UK over the total course of its lifetime produces 3 times less CO2 than a petrol car. And that figure will get higher and higher as our grid gets cleaner. And yet people aren't allowed to refer to those vehicles by the terminology that we've all been using in the sector for years now.
Now, how does that link in with some of the work that you've done around the non-fuel emissions, such as brakes and tyres? Because I forget where it was now, but I read an article recently, I think it was US-based, that basically said EVs tear through tyres at a far higher rate than internal combustion engine ones. Now, you and I know that that's not particularly accurate. What does the data tell us on that? Do we know?
Firstly, the transition to EVs are good because they don't produce any nitrogen dioxide, which is bad for your lungs. They also don't produce any particulate matter from their exhaust pipes because they don't have one. But it's also worth noting that, exhaust and particulate matter emissions from the exhaust pipes of petrol and diesel cars has been getting much, much better years because of things like to move to Euro 5 and then Euro 6 and AdBlue and particulate filters. So an increasing share of the particulate matter in the air that we breathe is coming from non-exhaust sources, primarily tyre wear and brake pad wear. And so some people, as you say, have been saying that EVs are no better than the petrol diesel cars that they're replacing because they're heavier, therefore they produce more tyre wear. The story is nowhere near as simple or as convenient as that. I think the other big one here to talk about is brake pad wear. And EVs produce up to 95% less brake pad wear than petrol cars because they do not use their brakes. The number of stories of mechanics who work on EVs who say one of the biggest problems they face is brake pads seizing up because they are never used, and actually advise people to sometimes stamp on their brakes just to kind of keep them free to avoid that kind of challenge. Right? They just rely on their regenerative braking, and regenerative braking not only puts electricity back into your battery because it doesn't involve any friction, it doesn't produce any particulate matter. Now, what was really interesting was that they looked at how big a problem these different sources of particulate matter were in different environments. Now, the reality is that of all the particulate matter that comes from non-exhaust sources, tyre wear is the biggest source of particulate matter produced when a car is traveling at speed, like on a motorway. But people don't live on motorways and stuff. So if EVs do produce a bit more tyre matter, they're often producing it in environments in which there's not really many people around to breathe it. But when you go to an urban environment where obviously people live in very high concentrations, because cars are traveling slowly, tyre wear is fairly insignificant as a source of particulate matter. Brake pad wear is much, much, much more significant. And because EVs don't really produce particulate matter from brake pad wear, EVs are generally a significant improvement over petrol cars for air quality in the places where people breathe the air. And that is why I think it was an environment committee at DEFRA. They concluded that the shift to electric vehicles will represent a net improvement for air quality in the UK.
In the interest of balance, I do have to say, though, that as an EV driver, it's because of the torque and that, it's very easy to put the foot down and spin the wheels a little bit more. And that will contribute more to tyre wear. But it's not a fact that it's an EV. It's a fact that it's a powerful car. And, when I drove German sports cars, I had exactly the same problem, even though I didn't have an electric drivetrain under there.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
Let's talk about some of the Twitter threads you've posted with, facts and stats. The Telegraph, and we will come back to them again in this discussion, posted that EVs charged using public chargers are more expensive than petrol. And you took to them and took them down a peg or two. So,
well, that was them reporting on figures from ZapMap. And I know from some replies from the head of comms at ZapMap on that thread that they weren't particularly happy with how the Telegraph had reported their figures, because the way they presented it was that anyone charging on the public charging network would be paying more to fuel their cars than if they were driving a petrol car. What ZapMap said that is only the case if you are relying solely on expensive, rapid and ultra rapid chargers. And from what I've seen of surveys carried out by people like EVA England, is that EV drivers, that is not a behavior that most EV drivers do. The reality is most EV drivers can and do charge their vehicles at home. A lot of them can use those kind of like cheap nighttime towers that make driving an EV spectacularly cheap. And that if people are using public charging points, they're not doing it as much as the Telegraph would have you believe, and often will be using slower, cheaper residential chargers rather than solely rapid and ultra rapid vehicles. So my problem with the way the Telegraph presented that is it gave the impression that it is a common behavior for EV drivers to charge their cars solely on expensive, rapid and ultra rapid chargers. And that is not the case. And it resulted in the erroneous claim that any EV being charged on the public charging network will become more expensive to fuel than a petrol car. And that is not true.
Yeah. I always equate it to, if I drove a Range Rover that gets 12, 14 miles to the gallon and I only refilled it at motorway service areas where the petrol there is incredibly expensive, that's kind of the equivalence that they're trying to draw.
And that's what frustrates me is that we know that petrol car, who does all their filling up for their petrol car on motorway service stations? No one does. Because unless you're incredibly rich, it doesn't matter. People go out of their way to ever avoid being caught. On the rare occasions in my past when I've ever had to do that, I feel so stupid with myself for like having to have got to a point where I needed to fill up on the motorway, right? So that same motivation driver is going to discourage people from using those chargers unless they have to. Now, I think they have to more in the day and age because of, the range on an EV isn't quite as big. So if you are doing a long journey, it is probably going to necessitate a stop at a motorway service station. But the majority of current EV drivers charge is gained when they're charging at home. And that just wasn't reflected in that article at all. And that's what annoyed me. That's why I took to Twitter.
The Telegraph, again, funny that, did another article saying that the crashing second-hand car market is slamming the brakes on electric vehicles.
They published that story literally a week after the SMMT released data showing the second-hand market had grown 91% in a year. Almost doubled in size in a year. And then literally a week later, the Telegraph says that the second-hand market is crashing. Now, what was quite interesting about that, and this is a trait that's particularly displayed by the Telegraph, is they'll often have a very sensationalist negative headline that isn't actually then backed up by the article underneath. The article itself referred to that SMMT data. So how could you possibly write that headline while citing data that completely contradicts it? I feel there's a real effort to jump on the figures that suggest that sales of new EVs are kind of the rate at which they're increasing is slowing a little bit. And it has in a few months. I suppose the figures in terms of overall market share of new car sales of EVs has been a little disappointing. What's forgotten in that reporting is, for example, in January, EVs are the second fastest growing fuel segment in terms of new car sales. They grew year on year by like over 20%, while petrol was like down at 7% and diesel fell 10%. The fastest growing is plug-in hybrid electric vehicles at the moment, which obviously still have a battery. But then, so this effort to then try and say, but the second-hand market's crashing as well, like that is literally not backed up by any data. Auto Trader have said they're finding that demand for second-hand EVs over the past year has increased by over 60%. Used EVs are the fastest selling fuel segment on their site. An EV will spend less time being advertised before it's sold than any other type of car. And yet all of that's all out there. And it's just completely ignored. And it was based on a couple of conversations they seem to have had with some kind of car dealers. That, for me, is an example of anecdotal evidence that is not statistically significant compared to the SMMT saying this is what the overall market looks like.
Totally agree on that. One of the episodes that we did last year, we had Quentin and Claire Cullen from Stop Burning Stuff on, and we'll loop back to Stop Burning Stuff in a little while. But the quote that Quentin gave me on that discussion was, "Misinformation will kill the EV transition if we let it." Now, you did a massive thread on some of the anti-EV articles out there. It was prompted by the House of Lords report criticizing media for misinformation. Now, I don't know whether you can remember all the detail that you put in there, but you kind of chunked it down into a number of sort of subgroups. Do you want to go through some of those for us, please?
Yeah, I think that thread was like over 60 tweets. I'm not sure if many people get to read the whole thing, but I almost deliberately write them big just to kind of communicate the scale of the misinformation that we're dealing with. So I have to write a thread this long, otherwise I'll be missing stuff out. The context to that is the House of Lords Environment Committee produced a report on how the EV transition is going. And it cited a number of challenges And one of the challenges it said was the government wasn't doing enough to promote the positives of EV ownership and tackle the misinformation being spread about EVs in much of our media. And much of our media just decided to prove their point in the week afterwards by there was a deluge of anti-EV articles. We counted 20 plus, mainly in the Telegraph, but also the Sun, the Times, and the Mail got involved. And we felt the need to kind of tackle some of them. I did a big thread and tried to address all the different kind of themes of misinformation about EVs that was contained within those articles. The big one, which I've kind of already talked about, is EV sales, the notion that they're plateauing or the EV transition is somehow tailing off, or a columnist in the Sun even tried to claim that EV sales were falling, which is just categorically not true. So I've addressed that one. Secondhand market's growing, not maybe as fast as we would hope at the moment, but the secondhand market where most of us buy our cars, that's booming, to be quite honest. And so that is a good sign, as Auto Trader said, because they're seeing secondhand EVs reaching price parity with their petrol equivalents. They're saying that once you remove the barrier of higher upfront cost, it's evident that the demand is there. So that was a really positive thing to see Auto Trader say. But other things that they said in these barrage of articles, the notion that they're prohibitively expensive. But as I say, yes, the upfront ones are more expensive, but it's on the secondhand market that we're seeing price parity being achieved. And we're probably expecting more and more cheaper EVs beginning to arrive from the likes of China, which is why the likes of Bloomberg are predicting that we'll reach price parity for new EVs with petrol equivalents in 2025 next year. Ford say that they're going to shift their whole EV strategy towards smaller, more affordable electric vehicles, and Tesla making their big announcement about doing an affordable EV. You're like, will they, won't they? But, that's quite significant when someone like Tesla makes that kind of announces that kind of focus. What other things did they say? Only a minority of households have private off-street parking with which they can benefit from cheap charging tariffs. I mean, that is just manifestly not true. Although this is quite an interesting one, because this people have meltdowns with me on Twitter when I make this point, which is that up to 70% of UK households have access to private off-street parking. People refuse to believe that that's true. Often people who live in kind of terraced houses in London. It's hard to imagine that quite so many people. I'm someone who lived in London until under a year ago, and now I live in Cumbria. And you live in a rural area like this, and many more people do have access to private off-street charging. So this notion that it is a problem for the EV transition at the moment, that it's much cheaper for people who have driveways. The savings are nowhere near as great if you can't charge your car at home. But firstly, it's misrepresented the number of people that affects, because a majority of people can charge their car at home and use those cheap tariffs should they so wish, which makes an EV as cheap as 2p a mile to run, which is mind-bogglingly cheap. But it's also not a reason to call the whole transition off. It should be a use to pressure government to do more, to come up with solutions to enable people who don't have a driveway to be able to charge their vehicles using their household supply. Like, firstly, VAT. It's just completely unfair that you pay more VAT to charge your car at a public charger than to charge your car at home. That's ridiculous. But also, people like Turbocharge who are on Dragon's Den, that's that ability to install a gully that allows you to run a cable from your house under the pavement without causing any disruption to pavement users and charge your car using your household transport. That's a brilliant solution. And it's just being held up by fairly Byzantine planning laws at local authority level that, with a bit of oomph and a bit of direction from central government, could easily be overcome. So there are solutions there. I just get frustrated when papers point out that there's a flaw in the EV transition, i.e. it's not 100% perfect. No surprise, it's a brand new technology. It takes a time. When trains were invented, we suddenly didn't have all of our railways there in one go. It takes time for these things to be developed. And it's the same with the EV transition. So I get frustrated when, if something isn't perfect, they're like, let's call the whole thing off, rather than something isn't perfect. What can we do as newspapers to use our influence to influence government, to use its power to introduce the solutions that will overcome that problem? So yeah, there was that one. There was, linked to this notion that EVs will impoverish the middle classes. And you're like, how? How can a car that can be run as cheaply as 2p a mile be something that could impoverish the middle classes? It's just this scaremongering. There was someone else claimed that EVs are just bad products and that petrol cars are superior. And you're like, that's the first time I'd seen that one. And this is clearly someone who has not driven an EV. I mean, just the sheer acceleration, the quietness, the space inside the vehicle is just so phenomenal that is why 90% of EV drivers never have any intention of going back to driving a petrol or diesel car. If EVs were so bad compared to their petrol equivalents, everyone would be moving into an EV going, this is rubbish, and going back. And that isn't happening.
My favourite one was actually, I think it was the Daily Mail that posted two articles, one saying that all the chargers are empty, and the other one's saying that the revolution's been undermined by the lack of chargers. You can't have it both ways, can you?
Yeah, I made that point on Twitter. We got the two headlines up and went, EVs are damned if they do and they're damned if they don't. So there's two big areas where you get that complete contrast in reporting. You've got actually three. You've got one, the latest one from the Mail is, oh my God, people charging queues for public chargers, people getting into fights to access it, which I've never seen, but they kind of like to report it. So there's that one. So either chargers are too full or they're all empty because no one's buying EVs. And you're like, well, which one is it? You've got EVs are too expensive. No one can afford them up front. Then when the secondhand market's booming and prices are coming down quite drastically on EVs to make them accessible to lots more people are like, oh, they depreciate too much. This is awful. And you're like, which one is it? Which one is it? You can't. And I think the other one is this, there's that notion mysteriously that's come up recently that EVs are rubbish cars. They're terrible to drive and petrol are much better. Literally on the same page on the same day, the motoring section of The Sun announces that the Volvo EX30 is its car of the year. So this is a really interesting contrast you get within individual papers. You've got the comment sections often kind of like railing against EVs and kind of like getting quite hysterical about them. And then literally in the same paper in the motoring section, they'll be doing a review going, this car's amazing, 0 to 60 in 3 seconds. It's our car of the year. And so you've got this kind of real contrast that they completely contradict themselves. And it's quite amusing to watch, really.
Now, there's some fairly major and well-funded groups out there, such as Net Zero Watch, who are pumping out quite a lot of the, anti-EV, anti-renewables stuff. And you like to take them on as well. Now, how much of what they say is plain lies? How much of it is paltering, which I believe is a phrase that you've used on one of your threads, and how much of it is true? What's the percentage? What's the proportions there?
I'd say only about 10% is pure out and out lies, maybe 10 to 20, saying that only a minority of people have access to off-street parking. That's an out and out lie. That's just not true. The data clearly shows the opposite. I would say about 10, 20%, to about 10% is about true in that people without off-street parking, the EVs are actually more expensive to run if you're often for a poorer household than if you're a richer one, because if you're a poorer household, you're more likely to have to rely on off-street parking. On public charging, which makes your EV more expensive to run than someone who can afford to have a house with a driveway. Obviously, in places like London, there's some incredibly expensive houses without off-street parking, so it's a bit of a unique place. But that is fair, and that is unfair, that it shouldn't be more expensive to run an EV for a poorer household than a richer one. But everything else in the middle, I think, is this notion of paltering, which is a word I only learned recently through my job, which is this notion that where you take something that is an element of truth and use it to mislead. I would say that's about 70, 80% of it.
Yeah, I've done a whole episode on paltering. Yeah, it's rife. It's rife. And it's interesting because a lot of paltering people think is greenwashing, and it's not quite the same thing, but it's kind of the ballpark there. Now, you also have a few run-ins with people like Howard Cox from Fairfuel and Barry Crampton, who, I don't know whether you know, he's actually got a second social media account, which it's like an anonymous one, and he's rabidly anti-EV on that. How do you deal with people like that? Because there's two ways. You ignore them or you engage with them. And what's your preferred sort of approach on that?
I suppose there's a couple of different things. I think I'm happy to engage with someone who's maybe coming at it from a different side of things if they're willing to debate and argue in good faith. I am willing to change my mind on something if someone comes to me with some data that proves that what I am saying is wrong. And it's reputable and it's like, look, actually it's this. I have done that in the past. I think when I first started, I probably didn't recognize enough that for an awful lot of people who can't charge their cars at home, that EV driving isn't anywhere near as cheap as perhaps I was saying. And when people came to me and showed what it was actually like, I changed my mind. And if I feel that someone else is willing to kind of have an honest debate, then I'll happily debate with them. But if they're not, then I generally try to ignore unless they have said something a bit personal. I will probably say, well, actually, probably not fair doing that. I'm going to push back on that a little bit. Or I will try, if they say something that's kind of categorically untrue and they've got quite a few followers and I feel that they probably kind of have some influence, I will respond and go, well, actually, what you've said is false. The data actually shows this. Because I suppose a lot of my decision about whether or not to engage with people is determined by how influential I think they are. But I feel sometimes when they've got like 3,000 followers and I feel they're quite influential and they're misleading their followers, I feel it's probably the responsible thing to do to challenge back. And which is why I will invest quite a bit of time doing threads to respond to like Alison Pearson talking absolute nonsense about the fire risk of EVs. She's a very influential person. A lot of people will unfortunately listen to what she has to say about electric vehicles. And I feel you have to step up and challenge inaccuracies.
Now, Labour recently backed off their commitment to spend £28 billion on green initiatives when they get into power. What's your take on that?
It's very disappointing. Probably Labour have coming into quite a bit of criticism for not actually articulating much in the way of kind of concrete policy about what they would do in government. And there's probably good kind of like politically strategic reasons why they're choosing to take that approach. This felt quite concrete, from someone who's concerned about the climate crisis and the impact it will have on us. It was good to see a kind of political party actually articulate something quite ambitious about what it will do to help move Britain towards net zero. But actually, there's something else that Britain has been missing for quite some time, which is investment, which is building infrastructure. We are way towards the bottom of the table of all of our compared to developed Western world countries in terms of like what proportion of our GDP we actually invest in building stuff. And you need to invest and build things to actually grow and develop our economy. And it's probably one of the reasons why our economy has been stagnating for so long is that we haven't been investing. So for me, that wasn't just a plan to help tackle the climate crisis and get us to net zero. It was an industrial strategy. And we don't have an industrial strategy. And it's driving a lot of us slightly potty that we don't really have a plan for how we are going to help Britain move towards the technologies and the industries of the future. And if we don't build in them, there's plenty of other countries that are going to step in and take that market from us. That, in a way, was an element of it that kind of really disappointed. I still think what they are committing to is probably slightly more ambitious than what the current government is doing. And perhaps there will be, depending on this, if they win and what the size of their majority might be after the next election, perhaps they might be more confident to reassert something slightly more ambitious. But I think polling suggests it turned more people off than it turned them on. We did some polling and found that 43% of voters were likely to interpret the U-turn as Labour lacking real plans for power, compared to only 25% of people who thought that it demonstrated that Labour was fiscally responsible. So it isn't something that played particularly well with the public. Twice as many people more likely to react to it negatively than positively.
Do you think that they're backing down on the financial commitment versus they're still going to try and do whatever they can? The policies are there, but the amount of money that they want to spend may change? Or are they basically saying, well, no, there's a lot of stuff we are just not going to do?
They don't seem to have dropped any particular policy. They've just rode back on the scale of the ambition for those policies. So I think one example is that they had originally a target for insulating homes, which is incredibly important for reducing energy consumption, from 19 million to 5 million. So the ambition the recognition of the importance of improving the efficiency of our homes is there. And there is an ambition to do something about it. It's just not as much. They talk about, it's all about watering down. So their overall plan for 28 billion a year goes down to 24 billion over the entire parliament. So a significant reduction in ambition, but not necessarily on policy. Now, they have made an argument, which is the economy's a mess. It will be irresponsible of us to kind of like commit to these huge figures until we see what the scale of the mess is and what we can do to actually get the economy growing again, generate the income that will allow us to have the tax revenues to invest in these things. I get it. But personally, I think that's a bit chicken and egg, because I think you need to invest to get the economy going. So it's, any incoming government at the next election is going to inherit a really unpleasant economic situation. So I have some sympathy with the challenges that they face, but I think they, in their communications around this issue, underestimated the importance of investing to get the economy going again. And I obviously liked their focus on investing in green technologies as a means of achieving that goal.
Talk to me about some of the work that you're doing with, we mentioned Quentin and Claire from Stop Burning Stuff. How are they leveraging your expertise?
I'm in lots of WhatsApp groups with them, and we share a lot of ideas, and I speak at their events, and I'm going to be a fully charged, or is it Everything Electric now? This year, it's in London, in Harrogate. So there's been a recognition that we need to do more to coordinate. I think there's more we can do as a sector to kind of like rally around specific figures. So a lot of different organizations working in the sector will have their own figure for the amount of money that an electric vehicle will save its owner every year compared to a petrol car. And I think because we all reuse these different figures, we're missing the opportunity to have one figure, like say, I don't know, £700 a year. If all of us in the sector could be kind of agree on what that figure is and just relentlessly be communicating it, it's much more likely to have cut through. So we're doing some work to think about how we can better agree on what those figures are and kind of like ramp up our communication around them. But we certainly, I lean on the likes of like Dr. Ewan McTurk, who kind of advises Fully Charged, and his expertise as a battery person has really helped me improve my understanding on future technologies and battery ranges and battery health and life. We're going to be doing a bit more this year to kind of like coordinate our activity in the run up to a general election, because I'm quite concerned that this will be the first general election in quite a long time in which transport issues actually are used as a wedge issue, in which there will actually be battle lines drawn and quite public spats fought over things like the EV transition. You're already seeing some of the kind of like the right-wing press over the weekend kind of attacking Labour for reaffirming its commitment to move the phase-out date for purely new petrol and diesel sales back from 2035 to 2030, where it originally was before the government U-turned on it last October. So they're attacking them for that. They're trying to accuse Sadiq Khan of wanting to introduce road pricing. And I think by the next step, they'll attempt to say that that's what Labour has planned. We know that both political parties actually are sympathetic to the idea where as fuel duty falls because everyone moves to electrics, the Treasury is facing a £30 billion black hole. Something needs to be done to fill that black hole. And we probably shouldn't remove all taxation from cars because everyone will just use them loads and our cars will get all clogged up. So road pricing, paying per mile that you drive, seems quite reasonable. We know that Labour is sympathetic to the idea, the Conservatives are sympathetic to the idea, but we also know that if one of them sticks their head above the parapet and goes, yeah, maybe we should introduce this, the other party will attack them for being anti-motorist. So that debate is not going to happen in the run-up to a general election. I think the best thing you need to hope for is someone winning the general election with a big majority that gives them the confidence to tackle a thorny issue like that. So yeah, just anticipating a bit more what our lines might be on the various attack vectors around electric vehicles and kind of getting our house in order and pushing back against some of the stuff we might see as general election fever gets more pronounced.
Are you in discussions with James Court and the EVA England, because they're putting together a manifesto?
Actually on my list to touch base with James Court, so I will definitely ask him to do that. Yes, no, I've seen that they've done that. I thought their survey of EV drivers was incredibly useful, particularly for challenging some of the misconceptions that non-EV drivers have about the realities of EV ownership. I think a lot of people who don't drive an EV think you're probably having to plug it in every day or every time you go out for a drive, when the survey proves that an awful lot of people are using public charging points 2 to 3 times a quarter. So some of the stuff they've done there. Yeah, no, I need to chat to them about that. And it's been quite interesting the last few months in that we've seen industry be a lot more outspoken about what they think the government needs to do to support the EV transition. They've gone suddenly for like saying halving VAT on new EV vehicles, or what more can be done to subsidize kind of like EV purchases to kind of like boost the market. So actually understanding what industry is saying as well and having a bit more of a conjoined approach about you're committed to the EV transition. The government did a pretty ambitious thing in introducing a zero emission vehicle mandate. That has to be applauded. But they haven't put a huge amount in place to help people, help car manufacturers, help individuals buy the vehicles that they want to see sold as a result of that mandate. So I think a bit more of a manifesto. And I think it's a really good way for parties to actually demonstrate they're on the side of motorists and the green transition by demonstrating what they will do to help people make the shift to EVs.
I don't have any more questions. Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would have liked me to have talked about?
I think the one point I probably wanted to make that I think that is really important for podcasts like this and any mechanism that can achieve it is the biggest solution. I think the best thing to combat the misinformation we're seeing in the press is the actual experience of EV drivers. We did a poll recently that found something quite interesting, that for the first time, just over half of the members of the general public actually know someone, either a family member or a close friend, who owns an EV. And we think that's quite significant because I think word of mouth, the experience of owning an EV from a trusted source, a person that's close to you, that you love, and you trust what they say, is going to be quite critical. Because I think what Alison Pearson or Matt Lynn have to say about EVs in the Telegraph is going to be trumped by a close family member having bought a Tesla and gone, this thing's amazing, you should try it. Seriously, don't listen to what those guys say. We haven't experienced any of those problems, it's brilliant. And I'm pretty confident that's what people say because we know that 90% of EV drivers have no intention of going back to petrol or diesel. So I think there's probably more those of us working on this side of the debate can do to think about what creative things can we do to get the voice of EV drivers out there and demonstrate that the stuff that people are hearing, that non-EV drivers are hearing about EV ownership, just aren't true. And that's certainly a challenge I think that the House of Lords has laid down to the government, which is tackle this, get the actual lived experience of EV drivers out there, because that'll do a lot to reassure people who are wavering about whether or not to get an EV.
A couple of takeaways from this discussion. When we chatted with Stop Burning Stuff last season, they were very focused on ensuring that the media as spreading the right message regarding electric vehicles. Colin's work is building very much on that, more so as a result of the House of Lords report discussing misinformation in the press. Colin spends a lot of time researching and putting together reports and Twitter threads about the misinformation surrounding EVs. The key difference is these are fact and data supported rather than anecdotal. It was also interesting to hear his thoughts on entities such as Net Zero Watch, who engage in a huge amount of paltering when it comes to EVs, heat pumps, and renewables. Now, for reference, if you want to listen to the episode on paltering, it's number 202 from earlier this season. The discussion with Quentin Wilson and Claire Cullen from Stop Burning Stuff was episode 198 from last season, and both are linked in the show notes. My thanks to Colin for a fantastic discussion. I could have chatted with him all day. This season, we're looking at raising the awareness of carbon literacy with our listeners. One way we're doing that is with a carbon fact, as read by carbon literacy trainer Ance Nelson.
One of the easiest things you can do to cut emissions is transfer your electricity to renewable supply. That helps solar and wind producers and sends a signal to fossil fuel providers saying we want to move away from oil and gas. Switching is really quick and easy, so why not give your supplier a call?
It's time for a cool EV or renewable things show with your listeners. Scientists have discovered a tiny bacterial minion that converts carbon dioxide into stone. Now, we've talked about carbon capture before on this show. It's a proven technology with some serious downsides, such as cost, scalability, high energy use, and the fact that a lot of the captured carbon is then pumped right back into oil wells to pump out more black gold. Well, researchers in Wyoming may have found a potential solution. Normally, if you pump carbon dioxide into the ground, it will, over time, crystallize into a form that is safe for the environment. The problem is this takes anything up to 10 years. In the meantime, lots of this carbon dioxide escapes, as any geological fault will allow it to head back into the atmosphere, and it's all just really, really not ideal. There is a bacteria called Geobacillus, which can speed the crystallization process up dramatically. In fact, it can cut 10 years down to just 10 days. The idea is that carbon dioxide is pumped into empty oil repositories, which have been mined out. The bacteria creates an enzyme called carbonic anhydrase, and the carbon dioxide is crystallized as a byproduct. If this can be scaled up, it would be a bit of a game changer for carbon sequestration. The EV Musings podcast is sponsored by ZapMap, the go-to app for EV drivers in the UK, which helps our EV drivers search, plan, and pay for their charging. ZapMap is free to download and use, with subscription plans for enhanced features such as using ZapMap in-car, on CarPlay, or Android Auto. And that's the show for today. I hope you enjoyed listening to it. If you want to contact me, I can be emailed at info@evmusings.com. I'm also on Twitter at MusingsEV. If you want to support the podcast and the newsletter, please consider contributing to becoming an EV Musing patron. The link is in the show notes. Don't want to sign up for something on a monthly basis? Well, if you've enjoyed this particular episode, why not buy me a coffee? Go to coffee.com/evmusings and you can do just that. ko-fi.com/evmusings. Takes Apple Pay too. I have a couple of ebooks out there if you want something to read on your Kindle. So, You've Gone Electric is available on Amazon worldwide for the measly sum of 99p or equivalent, and it's a great little introduction to living with an electric car. If you're looking for installing solar panels, storage, battery and a heat pump, try So You've Gone Renewable, also available on Amazon for the same 99p. And if you've got Amazon Prime and you can use the Kindle Lending Library, you can read them for nothing. Why not check them both out? Links for everything we've talked about in the podcast today are in the description. If you enjoyed this podcast, please subscribe. It's available on iTunes or wherever you get your podcasts. Please leave a review. It helps raise our visibility and extend our reach in search engines. If you've reached this part of the podcast and are still listening, thank you. Why not let me know you've got to this point by tweeting me at MusingsEV with the words non-factual narratives. # if you know, nothing else. Thanks, as always, to my co-founder Simon. You know, despite the fact he's happy to careen down a path at high speed on his electric unicycle or fly across a road on an electric skateboard, he's very, very cautious when it comes to buying things like electric mopeds or e-bikes. I asked him if it was a cost issue. He told me you wouldn't catch him ever riding a moped.
That is a comparative death trap, statistically.
Thanks for listening. Bye.